reported the death of a teenager in Cook County. Are you familiar with this case? If so, is this the state's first teenage death? And can you tell us if the teenager in question had underlying conditions?
Okay, we're going to get a definition now of how you can determine whether or not someone died with COVID. Very simple.
I don't have that information at my disposal at this time. I know we have had people of all age groups die. I just want to be clear in terms of the definition of people dying.
Okay, here comes the definition of death by COVID.
Of COVID. So the case definition is very simplistic. It means at the time of death, it was a COVID positive diagnosis.
Now, COVID positive diagnosis has already been debunked because at least 60 to 80% of all COVID tests are false positives.
Diagnosis.
That means no matter how you die, as long as you were positive for COVID when you died, you are a COVID death. Even if you got in a car wreck or you fell off a cliff, for whatever reason that you died, as long as you had COVID, it's counted as a COVID death. Listen.
So that means that if you were in hospice and had already been given, a few weeks to live, and then you also were found to have COVID, that would be counted as a COVID death.
There it was. Okay. She's even going to make it more simple for us.
Means that if even if you died of a clear alternate cause, but you had COVID at the same time, it's still listed as a COVID death.
So technically, even if you died of an alternate cause, if you had COVID when you died, it's called a COVID death. You wonder why the numbers are messed up.
We saw a declaration by a congressman last week on our show saying even when we do these antibody tests, scientists don't really even know what a positive test means.
Even tests meeting FDA's standards can be false more than half of the time, especially if the prevalence of COVID-19 in the surrounding population is low. And even with a true positive, scientists are not sure even what that means.
That there was some fishy things going on in the policies of how they were handling this pandemic because it was divergent from any past policies that I'd ever been familiar with. I went and looked at the papers that had claimed to isolate this virus, and there are essentially 4 papers. And when I read these, I read them very closely, and I had to, do some investigation because they use kind of a lot of language that's difficult to understand unless you're publishing in this field. So it took me a bit to parse out exactly what they did, but what I found out is that they never isolated or purified a virus. So what I mean is, in order to identify a virus, it's basically a particle, right, that has a membrane and inside of it some genetic material and a few proteins throughout. And so in order to identify that, what you would do is that you would basically purify it from a sick person, from the diseased part of their body. In this case, they took samples from lung fluid because the people that they identified as having this illness had respiratory symptoms. But they never actually purified any viral particles out of that lung fluid or out of their tissue culture experiments later on. Instead, what they did is they amplified a piece of genetic material that had a part of its sequence that they were specifically looking for because they had pre-identified these sequences as being from viruses. And they just basically identified a snippet of this genetic material and said that this was a virus. And they did really nothing more. So there was never a particle that was purified from which they would extract genetic material and say, this RNA came from this particle, therefore it belongs to the particle and it makes up a basically genome of a virus. They never actually purified any viral particles out of that lung fluid or out of their tissue culture experiments later on. Instead, what they did is they amplified a piece of genetic material that had a part of its sequence that they were specifically looking for because they had pre-identified these sequences as being from viruses. And they just basically identified a snippet of this genetic material and said that this was a virus. and they did really nothing more. So there was never a particle that was purified from which they would extract genetic material and say, this RNA came from this particle, therefore it belongs to the particle and it makes up a basically genome of a virus.